I believe it was earlier in the day, and I believe it was in response to some questions from Senator Gosh about rents for embassies. Are we still paying rent on the Ukrainian embassy, the embassy in Kyiv? Ms Adams?
Senator, I'll ask my OPO colleagues to help me, but I know that we still have the fifth floor of the top floor, in fact, unfortunately, of the Canadian Embassy available for our use. But, and Ms Pitson will correct me if I'm wrong, but we no longer have the leases on the residential accommodation.
Thank you. Senator Suzanne Pitson, Executive Director of the Overseas Property Office. Yes, we have an MOU arrangement with the Canadian Embassy that is still on foot.
And what's the annual cost of that?
I can take that on notice and come back to you over the course of the...
But there is a cost to it?
Yes, there is. We pay a fee-for-service arrangement.
Yep. OK. So that embassy's now been vacant for nearly 2.5 years. Can you come back to me on notice how much we've spent in that time on an empty embassy?
I can take that on notice, Senator, yes.
Thank you. On the 27th of April, the DPM was asked why the embassy hasn't been reopened. His answer was, and I'm quoting here, "We're working through the logistics and the issues of reopening an embassy in Kyiv. There's a range of issues associated with that which are being processed by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade." Ms Adams, can you please highlight what those range of ongoing issues are?
Senator, yes, I can. The matter is, as was said, under consideration. If I start by reminding that the embassy that we had set up in Kyiv was, well, originally called a pop-up embassy. It was in response to the MH17 shooting down of the plane, as you know. So we had a budget of about $1 million a year then for that embassy. Since the decision was made in early 2022, obviously before I was in this position, in fact, under the former government, when the decision was made to temporarily relocate out of that embassy. Of course, when you do that, you have to decommission the communication systems, the security settings, and all the information and, you know, security communication systems. So one aspect of the logistics is working out how we would now, under conditions of war, re-establish those systems.
But that work's being done currently?
We're examining how we would go about doing it. Likewise, residential accommodation, we would have to find, now given the uncertain and volatile situation and the fact that cities across Ukraine, as well as energy facilities across Ukraine, are being constantly under attack of missiles and drones. We would have to look for residential accommodation that had access to bomb shelters and had, you know, was appropriate for the vastly different circumstances that now prevail in Kyiv. We would also need to address the need for real-time intelligence communication. Most of that communication would come through defence channels. Australia obviously doesn't have Australian defence presence in Ukraine. We also don't have. We're not in NATO, so we're not in the NATO defence communication system. We'd have to work out how to have access to that kind of real-time information to provide as much security as would be possible. So there, as well as the budgetary aspect. So there's many aspects that need to be sorted out to allow a possible operating again, having the ambassador and the deputy operating in Kyiv rather than operating out of Warsaw, which is where they're primarily operating out of now. We would also have to think about how to manage the psychosocial risks of living in a situation where air sirens can be sounded several times a week. So I've read some accounts of the stress for people living there, having their nights disrupted several times a week, having to go down for several hours at a time into bomb shelters. That's not a normal work environment, needless to say, under an Australian legal framework. So the way that we adjust for that, or not even adjust, the way that we manage or try to mitigate those risks to some extent in other places is to have arrangements for spending time out of country. So that obviously requires a bigger staff footprint. That obviously has very significant budgetary impact. So there's a lot of things to work through.
Sure.
So Senator, I think we are all looking at what are the ways in which how can we continue to back in Ukraine. And Ms Adams has gone through some of the issues associated with an issue I appreciate you've been very consistent in your advocacy on. I think from the government's perspective, there's a judgment, not only, there are the judgments Ms Adams has to make about staff welfare, wellbeing, safety. There's also a judgment, I think, about what is the, in a sort of finite budgetary context, what are the things that we think and the Ukrainians think are the highest priority? And we have tried to look to those sorts of issues, which is why there was priority on military assistance, for example, in the first quarter of the year. Not
Sure.
quite quarter, first 4 months.
Yeah. Mr Keenan, you were previously ambassador to Israel, weren't you?
I was, Senator, correct.
In your time there, did you ever hear rocket warnings, missile warnings from the embassy or your residents?
Fortunately, in my time, very rarely.
But you did?
On less than a handful of times, Senator.
But you're all right? You haven't suffered any
I
psychosocial
think I'm all right.
risk?
That's for others to judge, but I think so.
That's a very
Wow, I tell you what, the laugh in the room's not helping.
risky, risky question.
We'll leave that there. Ms Adams, I hope this work is ongoing to resolve these issues. Obviously, DFAT resolved these issues in many other places that you operate. It has been 2.5 years. You are continuing to spend rent there. I think the Australian people, and I know the Ukrainian people, would very much welcome to have the embassy back open in Kyiv.
Senator, I note that actually it will cost significantly more to have our staff return to Kyiv than it is currently costing the rent in Kyiv notwithstanding. So
Sure.
It's not a money-saving option, I can tell you that. Also, I would forget the earlier point that you made now on other places. Well, of course, those embassies were built in a different context, if you're talking about Tel Aviv or Baghdad for that matter, and also the capacity to withstand those missile attacks, as you well know, is significantly different. In fact, Ukraine itself has been saying very consistently that its current capacity to have reliable air defence is inadequate. And that's one of the reasons why Australia, the US and others have focused military assistance on improving air missile defence capability. So I think, you know, it's just the reality that the contexts are different. Our missions have been established in different ways, and the security that we have in those other missions is very expensive.
And yes, as I've said before, you know, during I was on the Public Works Committee, and we went through some of those requests for money for some overseas posts that needed a lot of security.
Yes.
None of them are in such a geopolitical and geostrategic strong point or point of conflict as Ukraine.
I'm not sure that's absolutely true over time with respect to Australia's interests, but I also repeat what I've said earlier, which is that while, you know, we would all, including me, prefer to have our diplomatic staff work in Kyiv, we are adequately covering our interests through the combination of having our locally engaged staff in Kyiv, our ambassador and his deputy in Warsaw, and of course, as has been referenced earlier, a lot of contact with the embassy here.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Senator Van. Now, Senator Sharma.